For the first time in its history, NATO says that China is its major challenge. According to this report by Bradley Blankenship of RT News, he says, U.S. says NATO will address the problem of China, but other members don't seem so eager. So, of course, there is division in NATO. Now, this report goes on to say, according to a recent report by the Financial Times, the U.S. is ramping up the pressure to transform NATO, and this is a military bloc created during the Cold War to counter the spread of communism, of course, by the Soviet Union. They want to transform NATO into an anti-Chinese alliance. And this ministry has been saying for years now that you will see NATO go to war with China, as it is prophesied in Numbers, the 24th chapter, verse 24. Now this goes on to say, the paper quotes the U.S. ambassador to NATO as saying that the allies would move from what we call assessing the problem to addressing the problem. Of course, in the ambassador's lexicon, the problem is China, and addressing it means stepping up the pressure against the Asian superpower. It says this would be European and European-descended countries squaring off against an Asian country. It says here that there are some signals that NATO may move in this direction. Indeed, the bloc's first strategic concept document in over a decade, which was published this year, does name China as a major challenge for the first time ever. At the same time, there has been significant pushback against the Washington-led confrontation with Beijing. Notice, the Washington-led confrontation against China. Of course, NATO was founded by the United States. Back in 1949, it was called the Washington Treaty originally. The United States funds NATO mostly, and they lead NATO. They are in charge of NATO. So whatever Washington says goes. And so here it says the Washington-led confrontation with Beijing. There's been pushback from both NATO countries and NATO partners in China's neighborhood, talking about the Trilateral Commission, where they just had a meeting about this. And it says at the end, the consensus was that without proper steering, the U.S.-China rivalry may lead the world into a dangerous confrontation, which is, of course, going to happen as you read in Ezekiel, the 38th chapter. Now, this article goes on to say that these Asian officials, at the end of this meeting, one official, Japanese official, was quoted as saying, "We must engage China," in response to a speech by the U.S. ambassador to Japan, and a veteran official from the Philippines who said that when two elephants fight to the death, we will all be dead. Warning that if these two major nuclear superpowers, they confront one another and they go to war, then the whole world is going to go down. So, of course, they must be careful when they're dealing with China. Now, it says here a similar trend is also emerging in Europe. EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell recently spoke at the Brussels Indo-Pacific Forum. According to him, a vast majority of European countries do not want to have to choose either the US or China. We don't want a world that is split into camps. Then he says the EU is not a NATO representative, but a significant number of EU member states are part of the Defense Alliance, which makes these words quite significant. And this is what we see in Bible prophecy. In Daniel, the 2nd chapter, we see the iron with the potter's clay. And if you read our booklet, Middle Eastern Prophecy and What is the Beast of Prophecy, we prove to you that the iron with the potter's clay is NATO. And it says that the kingdom shall be divided. And of course it is divided between two alliances, the EU and NATO. And so here we see this representative saying that even though the EU is not a NATO representative, we have EU countries in this defense alliance, the iron with the potter's clay. Now, it goes on to say here that several European leaders, like the German Chancellor, the Prime Minister of the UK, and others, are not for confronting Beijing. They want to talk to Beijing, deal with Beijing. So they're not on board with what Washington wants. So here we see division in NATO, which is, of course, prophesied in the Bible. And it says at the end here, with all this taken together, It is hard to square these developments with the words of U.S. officials quoted in the Financial Times. If we take addressing the problem to mean NATO allies will collectively move towards countering Beijing, then it appears that this will not happen. Quite the contrary. The bloc seems to be very disjointed when it comes to Beijing. In fact, the majority of the bloc's members appear to be looking for ways to cool tensions with China instead of heating them up at Washington's direction. So we see division in NATO, and you will continue to see divisions in NATO to the point where the Article 5 of the Charter of NATO will be abandoned when NATO goes to war with China, as we see in Bible prophecy. Notice what it says here. It starts here in Daniel, the 11th chapter, verse 45. Who is the king of the north? Now, we prove to you in those booklets, Middle Eastern Prophecy, and Who is the Beast of Revelation, that the king of the north is NATO. And, of course, who leads NATO, who funds NATO? It was called the Washington Treaty. Who is the king of the north? The President of the United States of America. And we show you in the booklet, Daniel 11:40 through 44 has already been fulfilled in the Gulf War and the war on terrorism. And the next great prophetic event is in Daniel 11:45, where it says that he, that's NATO, the President of the United States, shall plant the tabernacles of his palace, that's military bases, military occupation, between the seas and in the glorious holy mountain. When we see that, then it says, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. The end of NATO. The NATO allies are going to abandon the king of the north, the President of the United States. Now, why? Well, notice what it says here in Jeremiah, the 30th chapter, verse 14. It says, all your allies, the Moffat translation has allies, have forgotten you. They seek you not. They abandon the king of the north, the President of the United States. Notice, for I have wounded you with the wound of an enemy, with the chastisement of a cruel one, for the multitude of your iniquity, because your sins were increased. And then in verse 15 it says, why criest thou for thine affliction? So here we see the NATO alliance, the king of the north, getting a deadly blow. And when he receives that deadly blow, the NATO allies abandon him. They want nothing to do with this war, as we read here in this article, that the NATO partners, they're not on board with Washington. Washington wants to confront China, but the NATO partners, they don't want to confront China, especially not militarily. Now, where do we see this deadly blow in Bible prophecy? Numbers, the 24th chapter, verse 24. Notice what it says. It says, and the ship shall come. So here we see a naval attack. And who has the largest navy in the world right now? Well, China. And it says here that the ship shall come from the coast of Kittim. Kittim is China. And we prove that in our booklet, China in Prophecy. And these booklets that I've mentioned, I'll put them in the description below. And of course, you can download them absolutely free of charge. The ship shall come from the coast of Kittim and shall afflict Asher. Who is modern day Asher? Germany. And Germany leads the alliance called the EU. Shall afflict Asher and shall afflict Eber. Those are the Hebrew peoples, the house of Israel, the potter's clay. And if you read our booklet, The United States and Britain in Prophecy, we prove to you that the house of Israel, the potter's clay, is the United States, the British Commonwealth of Nations, and the peoples of Northwestern Europe. So here we see China going up against Asher, which is Germany, and the Hebrew peoples. It's obvious that it's NATO. They share a common enemy. The ship shall come from the coast of Kittim and shall afflict, there's that affliction, that deadly blow, Asher, and shall afflict Eber. So when they receive that deadly blow, that affliction from China, NATO is going to fall apart. And it says he shall come to his end and none shall help him. NATO will break apart. The military alliance will dissolve. And when that happens, we see in Ezekiel, the 38th chapter, Ezekiel 38, here it talks about Gog of the land of Magog, verse 2. And who is Gog? Read our booklet, China in Prophecy. We prove to you that Gog is China, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, that's Manchuria and Tibet. And it says, prophesy against him. He says, behold, I am against you, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. It says, I will turn thee back. That's old King James language. It means turn you around. I will put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you forth. And China has never invaded another country in its total existence. China has never invaded another country. That's why God uses this kind of language of putting hooks into his jaws and bringing you forth. All your army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, a great company, with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Then it, of course, lists all these nations. Persia, which is modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Put and Kush, which is Pakistan, and India. All of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, which is Cambodia, and Central Asia, Togarmah and North Quarters, and many people with you. Here is a huge assembly of people. And it says, be thou prepared. Prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto you. We have the Shanghai Corporation Organization, what they call the NATO in the East. And many of these countries are in it already. So here's a huge assembly of nations. And then it says, and be thou a guard unto them. Or as it should read, a leader. So China is the leader of this great assembly. And it says, after many days you shall be visited. In the latter years, that's the time setting of this prophecy, you shall come into the land, now it should read nation in the Hebrew, that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people. What country calls itself e pluribus unum? Out of many, one. The United States of America. That's the prime target. And then it says, against the mountains of Israel. Mountain is a symbol of a nation in Bible prophecy. Mountains, plural. Here we see a nation and a company of nations of Israel, the Ephraimite nations of Canada, Australia, New Zealand. That is brought back from the sword against the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste, meaning a place of refuge, which we are, but it is brought forth out of nations, and they shall dwell safely, even all of them. And then it talks about its attack, its ascend on the land like a storm, like a cloud to cover the land. Thou and all thy bands and many people with you. Now notice what it says here. It says that at the same time shall things come into your mind, and you shall think an evil thought. Verse 10, verse 11, it says, thou shall say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages, and I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor gates. That's Old Testament language for they let their defenses down, or their defenses are gone. And what did we read in Numbers the 24th chapter, verse 24, and Jeremiah the 30th chapter? We read that China gives NATO that deadly blow, and NATO, of course, abandons the alliance, and the whole defense alliance is gone. Their defenses are gone, and China sees it, and when he sees it, it says he's going to, verse 12, take the spoil, take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places which are now inhabited, upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods, that dwell in the midst of the land. So they're going to take over North America, Australia, and New Zealand. So war between the United States and China is coming. But this time, the United States is going to lose that war.